The screen at the front of the boardroom lit up with their whole life, their house on the water, their cars, the vacation home, the boat, the private school, the offshore accounts, all of it mapped in glowing lines back to a single source, the company they had stolen from a dying man 12 years ago. The couple at the end of the table had gone gray, and the man they had destroyed all those years ago, the man whose father they had put in the ground, leaned back in his chair, looked at the forensic accountant standing beside the screen, and said 4 quiet words that had waited 12 years to be spoken. Take everything from them. Nobody in that room breathed, because everyone understood he could do it. Every asset on that screen was traceable, every dollar was tainted, and the man giving the order had spent 12 years and an enormous fortune buying the power to make it happen with a phone call. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one, because the most important thing that happened in that boardroom was not the order he gave. It was the thing he remembered at the last possible second that his dying father had actually meant. And if a story about revenge, restraint, and what a good man does when he finally holds the knife moves you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell right now, because these stories get buried and you are the only reason they get found. His name was Darius King, and 12 years earlier, he had sat at the foot of a hospital bed and watched his father die of a broken heart, which is not a medical term, but is the truest description of what killed Nathaniel King. To understand the boardroom, you have to understand Nathaniel and the company and what was taken. Because revenge stories are cheap unless you know exactly what was broken, and what was broken here was one of the finest men who ever lived. Nathaniel King had built a company called Kingdom Development out of nothing. He had grown up in a neighborhood the city had written off, the kind of neighborhood where the buildings crumbled and the banks would not lend and the landlords let it all rot because the people who lived there had no power to demand better. And Nathaniel had made himself a promise as a young man that he would learn how the game of property and development actually worked, and then he would come back and play it for his own people. He kept the promise. He learned construction, then finance, then development, and he built Kingdom into a real company, and Kingdom did a thing almost no one in that industry did, which was build good, dignified, affordable housing in neighborhoods everyone else had abandoned, and make it work as a business, and prove that you did not have to choose between doing right and staying solvent. Nathaniel was beloved. Not in the way rich men buy being beloved with wings on hospitals, but in the real way, the way where old women in the buildings he built knew his name and waved from their windows, where he knew the names of their grandchildren, where a Kingdom building meant a landlord who fixed the heat and a rent you could actually pay. He employed hundreds of people from the neighborhoods he built in. He was in the truest sense a king, and Kingdom was his kingdom, and he ran it with his whole heart for 30 years. Let me give you one picture of Nathaniel, so he is not just a word like beloved to you, because Darius carried this picture his whole life. There was a woman named Miss Ada Price who had lived in the first building. Nathaniel ever developed an old walk-up he had bought as a wreck and rebuilt with his own crews when Darius was a boy. Miss Ada had raised 4 children in that building and buried a husband out of it, and she was the unofficial mayor of the block. And every single Christmas for 30 years, Nathaniel King personally delivered a ham to Miss Ada Price's door and sat in her kitchen and drank her coffee and listened to her tell him what was wrong with the building and the block and the world, and he fixed the things about the building that he could, because Miss Ada was the whole reason the company existed. Miss Ada specifically. But the 10,000 Miss Adas, the people the industry treated as a problem to be removed, and Nathaniel treated as the point. Darius, as a boy, rode along on those Christmas ham deliveries, and he watched his father sit in those kitchens, a wealthy man who did not have to be there listening to old women as though their opinions were the most important information in the city. And that is what Darius understood a king to be, long before he understood anything about finance or law. Hold on to Miss Ada Price. She comes back. His mistake, the only real mistake of his professional life, was Grant and Sloan Merrick. The Merricks came into Nathaniel's world about 15 years before that boardroom, and they came polished. Grant Merrick was a finance man, smooth, credentialed, connected, exactly the kind of sophisticated capital markets expertise that Kingdom needed as it grew. And his wife Sloan was a lawyer, sharp and elegant, who specialized in the complex legal structures that big development deals require. They presented themselves as believers in Nathaniel's mission. People who wanted to bring their expertise to work that mattered, and Nathaniel who judged people by their words and their handshakes because he himself was honest and assumed the same of others believed them. He brought them in. He made Grant his chief financial officer and Sloan his general counsel. He trusted them with the machinery of the company, the finance, and the law. The two areas Nathaniel himself, a builder at heart, understood least and needed most. And over the following years, patiently, invisibly, the Merricks stole his kingdom. They did it the way sophisticated people steal, not with a gun, but with paper. Grant, as CFO, gradually restructured Kingdom's financing in ways Nathaniel did not fully understand and trusted Grant to handle layering in debt, moving assets into subsidiaries, creating a financial structure so complex that only Grant could see the whole of it. Sloan, as general counsel, drafted the documents, and buried in those documents over years were provisions that slowly shifted control, diluted Nathaniel's ownership, and created triggers that the Merricks controlled. They were building a trap inside the company's own legal and financial architecture, and Nathaniel signed the papers his own trusted CFO and general counsel put in front of him, because that is what it means to trust the people you have hired to know the things you do not. And then when the trap was built, they sprang it. There was a manufactured financial crisis, a liquidity squeeze that Grant himself had engineered by the way he had structured the debt, and in the middle of it, the Merricks moved. Using the provisions Sloan had buried in the debt structure Grant had built, they orchestrated Nathaniel's removal from his own company, dressed up as a necessary restructuring demanded by lenders. Lenders who, it would later turn out, were entities the Merricks secretly controlled. They forced Nathaniel out. They took control of Kingdom Development, the company he had built with 30 years of his life, and they took his name off of it, and they took his life's work, and there was a document, a key document that authorized a critical piece of the transfer, and it bore Nathaniel's signature, and Nathaniel swore to his dying day that he had never signed it, that the signature was forged. He was almost certainly right. But proving a forgery against a lawyer and a financier who had spent years building the case that you were an incompetent old man who had lost control of his own company in a legal fight that requires money you no longer have because they have taken it, is a thing that almost never succeeds, and it did not succeed for Nathaniel. He spent the last of his money and his health trying. He lost. And Kingdom Development under the Merricks stopped being a kingdom. They stripped it. They sold off the affordable buildings to slumlords, evicted the tenants. Nathaniel had protected, laid off the employees. Nathaniel had hired and converted the whole thing into a conventional, ruthless, profitable development operation that did exactly what every other operation did, which was extract as much money as possible from land and people and give nothing back. The old women stopped waving from their windows because they had been evicted. The name Kingdom stayed on the door, hollowed out an insult to everything it had meant. Nathaniel King died 18 months after they took his company. The doctors called it heart failure. Darius, who sat at the foot of the bed, called it what it was, which was grief. The specific grief of a man who had built something beautiful and good, and watched it be stolen and defiled by people he had trusted, and could not stop it, and could not prove it, and had to die knowing the thieves had won, and his life's work had been turned into the very thing he had spent his life fighting. And at the very end, in that hospital room, Nathaniel King said something to his son. He was weak and bitter and dying, and he gripped Darius's hand with what strength he had left, and he said, "Take everything from them, son, everything. Promise me, don't let them keep one thing they took." Darius promised. He was 26 years old. He had nothing. And he made his dying father a promise that would organize the next 12 years of his life. He would spend a long time in the years to come turning those 4 words over, take everything from them, testing their weight, and it would be more than a decade before he understood that a promise made to a dying man is a sacred thing, but that the dying are not always their truest selves, and that the deepest form of keeping a promise is sometimes to honor the whole life behind the words rather than the wound that spoke them. Here is what Darius King did with those 12 years, and it is a remarkable thing, and I want you to feel the sheer patient enormity of it. He did not go to war immediately because he had nothing to go to war with, and he had learned from watching his father lose that rage without power is just noise, and that the Merricks had beaten his father precisely in the arenas his father was weakest, finance and law. So Darius went and became a master of exactly those arenas. He was smart, terribly smart, and now he was motivated by a grief that does not sleep, and he made himself into a finance man and then an investor, and then over years a very successful and very wealthy one. He was disciplined. He did not spend. He did not announce himself. He built capital, and he built knowledge, and most of all, he built patience, because he understood that the Merricks were entrenched and powerful, and that a frontal assault would fail the way his fathers had. He was not going to knock on the front door. He was going to spend as many years as it took to buy the building. There was a man who taught Darius in those early years, and he matters because Darius did not become who he became alone. His name was Solomon Reyes, an old investor, semi-retired, who had known Nathaniel slightly and respected him greatly, and who took a hungry, grief-stricken young man under his wing and taught him the arenas Nathaniel had been weak in. Solomon taught Darius finance and leverage and patience, but he also taught him something else, and he taught it deliberately because he could see the grief in the young man and where it might lead. "You're building yourself into a weapon," Solomon told him once years in. "I understand why, but I want you to remember something, because the day is going to come when you point the weapon, and on that day you'll find out whether I taught you finance or whether I taught you to be them. A weapon doesn't get to choose what it becomes. A man does. Don't forget you're a man." Darius nodded and did not fully understand it at the time, and filed it away the way you file away things wise. People tell you before you're ready for them. And it sat in him for years, waiting for a boardroom. And quietly and visibly, over the back half of those 12 years, that is what he did. He hired the best forensic accountants and investigators money could buy, and he set them on a single task to reconstruct dollar by dollar exactly what the Merricks had stolen and exactly where it had gone. It took years. The Merricks had spent over a decade laundering their theft into legitimacy, into the house on the water, and the cars, and the boat, and the offshore accounts, and the respectable philanthropy and unwinding that tracing the tainted money forward through a decade of transactions was painstaking work that Darius funded without flinching because he had promised. The forensic accountant who led it, Renee Okafor, was the best in the business, and even she told Darius more than once that most clients would have quit. The trail went through shell companies in 3 jurisdictions, through a sham charity, through real estate transactions, structured specifically to break the chain of custody of the money. Every time it looked like a dead end, Darius told her to keep going and wrote another check. There was a stretch of 8 months where they made no progress at all, and Renee gently suggested that perhaps enough had been proven, that Darius had more than enough to act. And Darius said no, not yet, because he had watched his father lose precisely because his proof had gaps that clever lawyers could drive through, and Darius was not going to walk into that boardroom with anything less than a case so complete that no lawyer alive could find a crack in it. So they kept going. And in the 9th month, Renee found the thread that tied it all together, a single transaction the Merricks had thought was invisible, and from there the whole structure unraveled, and the glowing map that would one day fill the boardroom screen took its final shape. 4 years in the end, 4 years of one woman's life and a fortune of Darius's money to reconstruct 12 years of theft so completely that it could never be denied. That is what patience costs. Most people cannot pay it. Darius could, because he was not paying with money, not really. He was paying with a promise made at the foot of a bed. And on the other front, he began through entities that could not be traced to him to acquire the debt. The same trick the Merricks had used on his father, Darius used on them. He found where Kingdom Development, the hollowed-out company they now ran, was financially vulnerable, and he patiently, quietly bought up its debt position by position through a web of vehicles until, without the Merricks having any idea, Darius King held the notes on the company that had been his father's, and held the financial leverage to force his way into the boardroom, and held in a set of forensic reports thick as phone books the documented proof of everything they had ever stolen. 12 years. And then one day everything was in place, and Darius King walked into the boardroom of Kingdom Development, controlling its debt, holding its whole secret history, and he sat down at the table across from Grant and Sloan Merrick, who did not know who he was because he had been careful, and who were about to find out. The meeting had been called under a pretext, a routine matter with a major creditor who wished to discuss the terms of the company's debt. That much was true. Darius did control the debt through an entity called Meridian Holdings that no one had connected to him. What the Merricks did not know was that Meridian was Darius, that the routine discussion was the culmination of 12 years, and that the quiet, well-dressed man who would be representing the creditor was the son of the man they had buried. The Merricks came in polished and unconcerned the way they had come into everything for 12 years, secure in their empire. Grant did most of the early talking, smooth and slightly condescending toward the creditor's representative, this Mr. King, whose name did not register with him because Grant Merrick had long ago stopped thinking about Nathaniel King at all. The man he had destroyed was to Grant a closed file, an old victory not worth a moment's memory. That was perhaps the cruelest detail of the whole thing, and Darius clocked it in the first 2 minutes. They did not even remember his father. They had taken a man's entire life, and it had not been significant enough to them to leave a mark. He had spent 12 years on the defining catastrophe of his life, and to them it had been a Tuesday. He let Grant talk, and he watched the two of them, and he felt the old grief and the old rage rise up exactly as he had known they would, and he made himself breathe, because Solomon Reyes's voice was in the back of his head. A weapon doesn't get to choose what it becomes. A man does. And then Darius set down his pen and interrupted Grant Merrick mid-sentence, and the interruption itself was so quiet and so certain that the whole room turned. And Darius let the pretext run for a few minutes, and then he nodded to Renee Okafor, the forensic accountant who had spent 4 years of her life on this, and Renee stood, and she picked up the remote, and the screen at the front of the boardroom lit up. It began with a photograph of Nathaniel King. "Do you know who this is?" Darius asked quietly. The Merricks stared at the screen. Grant's face did something complicated. Sloane's went still. "I'll help you," Darius said. "His name was Nathaniel King. He built this company. He built it to house people you evicted and employ people you fired. You took it from him with forged paper and buried provisions and a manufactured crisis, and he died 18 months later, and I sat at the foot of his bed while he did." He let it land. Grant's mouth opened. It was the first time in the meeting that his smoothness had failed him. "King," he said slowly, and Darius watched the name finally reach him, watched 12 years collapse into a single second. Behind the man's eyes, watched the closed file reopen. My name is Darius King. I'm his son, and I've spent 12 years and a great deal of money getting to this chair. Renee, show them." And Renee Okafor walked them through it, slide by slide, the whole 12-year theft reconstructed in glowing, undeniable lines. The forged transfer document with a forensic handwriting analysis commissioned by Darius, concluding that Nathaniel King's signature on it was not authentic. The debt structure Grant had engineered exposed as the deliberate trap it was, the secretly controlled lenders. The laundering trail, tracing the stolen value forward through a decade into every asset. The Merricks now owned the house on the water glowing on the screen, purchased with money that led straight back to Kingdom's stripped assets, the cars, the boat, the offshore accounts, the philanthropic donations that had bought their reputation. Every glowing line on that screen ended at the same place: the theft of a dead man's kingdom. And when Renee finished, the boardroom was silent, and Grant and Sloane Merrick sat gray and cornered at the end of the table, understanding at last that the routine creditor meeting had been the trap, that they were the ones inside the trap now that the sophisticated architecture they had used to steal a company had just been used better against them. Darius King leaned back in his chair. He had waited 12 years for this exact moment. He looked at the couple who had killed his father, and he looked at the screen full of everything they owned, and he said the words his father had made him promise. Take everything from them. If your chest is tight right now, if you're waiting to watch the hammer come down, that feeling is exactly what this channel is built to give you, and the only way we keep making these is your tap on that subscribe button. Do it now, but wait for what happens next, because it is not what you think. Renee Okafor nodded and reached for her folder because Darius had the legal and financial mechanisms fully prepared. It truly was a matter of a signature and a phone call. Every asset on that screen could be frozen, clawed back, seized through the leverage Darius held in the fraud Renee had proven. He could do to the Merricks precisely what they had done to his father and more, because he was better at it than they had ever been. He could put them in the position Nathaniel had died in, stripped, ruined, disbelieved, destroyed. And Darius King raised his hand, a small gesture, and Renee paused her hand on the folder, and the room waited. Because in the second between giving the order and its execution, Darius King remembered something, and it stopped him cold. He remembered the rest of the hospital room, not just the bitter grip of his father's hand and the word, everything. He remembered what his father had been all his life before the last 18 months of grief hollowed him out. He remembered that Nathaniel King had built his entire life on the principle that you do not have to become the thing you are fighting, that you can win in this brutal industry without stripping the vulnerable, that doing right and staying solvent were not enemies. He remembered that his father, the real Nathaniel, The one who was not dying and bitter, but living and whole, would have been ashamed, genuinely ashamed, to watch his son become a mirror image of Grant and Sloane Merrick. A king who destroyed people with paper, who took everything, who evicted and stripped and ruined because he could and because it felt like justice. He thought in that suspended second about Solomon Reyes, dead now 3 years, who had told him that a weapon does not choose what it becomes, but a man does, and who had said it precisely because he had seen this exact moment coming a decade in advance, had known that grief forged into competence eventually finds a boardroom and a folder and a couple at the end of a table, and had wanted to make sure that when Darius got there, there would still be a man inside the weapon to make the choice. He thought about Miss Ada Price, whom he had not yet found but already intended to, and about what it would mean to hand her back her home versus what it would mean to hand himself the satisfaction of the Merrick's destruction. And he understood that he could not fully do both, that annihilating the Merricks and rebuilding his father's kingdom were past a certain point. Different projects requiring different souls. The dying words had been, "Take everything from them." But the dying words were not the man. The dying words were the wound. And Darius understood in that suspended second that if he honored the wound instead of the man, then the Merricks would win a final permanent victory, because they would have turned Nathaniel King's beloved son into one of them. They would have taken the last thing they had not managed to take, which was the goodness Nathaniel had spent 30 years trying to plant in the world and in his boy. So Darius King put his hand down slowly, and he did not give the order his father's grief had demanded. He gave the order his father's life had earned. "No," he said. "Renee, put the folder down. We're not going to take everything from them. We're going to do something harder." He looked at the Merricks, and there was no mercy in his face, but there was no cruelty either, only a terrible clarity. "Here's what's going to happen, and it isn't up for negotiation, because as you can see, I hold the debt and I hold the proof, and if you fight me, I'll hand all of it to the district attorney, and you'll spend what's left of your lives in court and quite possibly in prison. So listen carefully. You are going to give back what you took. All of it, not to me. I don't want the house on the water, and I don't want your boat. Restitution is going to the people you actually stole from, and that is a much longer list than my father. Every tenant you evicted from a kingdom building is going to be found and compensated. Every employee you laid off is going to be found and made whole to the extent money can do it. And this company, this hollowed-out thing with my father's name still on the door, is going to be put back to what it was. The stripped buildings that can be bought back will be bought back with the money on that screen, and they will be operated the way my father operated them, and the people you threw into the street will be offered their homes again at rents they can pay. Every glowing line on that screen ends at something you stole from someone. It's all going back to where it came from." Something happened then that Darius had not scripted, and it told him he had chosen right. Sloane Merrick, who had sat frozen and gray through the entire presentation, began quietly to cry. Not the performed tears of a cornered person playing for mercy. Darius had braced for those and would have felt nothing. These were different. These were the tears of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time. And she said in a low voice, not to Darius, but almost to the table, "I told him it would come back, 12 years. I told Grant that man's son is out there somewhere, and one day it's going to come back on us, and Grant said I was being dramatic, and I let him tell me that because it was easier than the truth, which is that I helped. I drafted the documents. I knew what the provisions did. I knew Nathaniel never read them the way he should have because he trusted us, and I did it anyway, and I have been rich and comfortable and unable to sleep for 12 years. She looked up at Darius, and her face was wrecked. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that at least one person at this table always knew exactly what we did to your father and never once, not for one single day, managed to make peace with it." Darius looked at her for a long moment. It did not change what had to happen, but it did something to him quietly, because it confirmed the thing Solomon had tried to teach him, that the people at the end of the table were not monsters. Whatever they had done, but human beings who had made themselves smaller and worse. One choice at a time, and that the whole question of the boardroom was whether Darius would let his own grief do the same thing to him, one choice at a time, starting now. Grant Merrick found his voice barely. "And us, what happens to us?" "You," Darius said, "you're going to sign over control of this company and cooperate completely with unwinding 12 years of fraud publicly on the record, so that the truth about what you did to Nathaniel King is known and can never be pretended away. Your reputation. The thing you spent stolen money to buy is going to be gone, and that's the part that will hurt you most, I know, because it's the part that would have hurt you most, which is exactly why it's just. And when it's done, you'll keep enough to live on, not the house on the water, not the empire. Enough. A normal, modest life, which is more than my father had at the end, and more than the old women you evicted had, and more than you deserve. But I'm not going to strip you and ruin you and put you in the position you put my father in and leave you to die of it, because if I do that, I don't honor my father. I become you, and I made my father a promise, and I've realized today what it actually was. He didn't need me to destroy you. He needed me to make sure you couldn't keep what you took. Those are different things, and it took me 12 years and this exact moment to understand the difference. He stood up. Take everything from them, Darius said quietly, almost to himself. That's what he said when he was dying and broken. But my father spent 30 years teaching me that you can win without becoming the thing you beat. That was the real man. So I'm going to take back everything you took down to the last dollar and return it to the people it belongs to. And I'm going to leave you your lives small and honest for the first time in decades. Because a king does not do to people what you did to my father, even when the people are you. Especially when the people are you. That's the difference between us, and it always was, and it's why in the end you were never going to win. Renee, let's begin. Now let me tell you what happened after, because the ending held, and it is worth having. The unwinding took 2 years, and it was every bit as painstaking as the 12 that came before, but it was joyful work. If forensic accounting can be joyful, because every step of it put something stolen back into the hands it was taken from. The Merricks, facing the choice between cooperation and prosecution, cooperated, and the truth of what they had done to Nathaniel King came out fully and publicly, and the forged signature was exposed, and Nathaniel King's name was cleared 12 years too late for him to know it, which is a grief Darius carried, but not too late for the world to know it, which is a justice he could give. Kingdom development became a kingdom again. Darius did not keep it for himself. That was never the point. He rebuilt it into what his father had made it: good, affordable housing in abandoned places run as a real business that proved doing right and staying solvent were not enemies. And he put it under a structure designed so that it could never again be stolen the way it had been stolen the first time, and then he stepped back from the day-to-day and let people who believed in the mission run it. And he watched from a distance as old women started waving from windows again. Some of them, the very same women who had been evicted, moved back into homes at rents they could pay. The employees who had been laid off were found and compensated, and many were rehired. The tenants who had been evicted were found and made whole, and where possible offered their homes back. And this is where Miss Ada Price comes back, because Darius made it personal, and he made it personal on purpose. The very first building the restored kingdom bought back was the old walk-up Nathaniel's First, the one the Merricks had sold to a slumlord who had let it rot and jacked the rents and driven out the families one by one. Darius bought it back himself, and he had it rebuilt the way his father would have rebuilt it, and then he did something that took his forensic team longer than tracing the offshore accounts. He found the evicted tenants, the ones still living scattered across the city into worse housing and harder lives. And he found Miss Ada Price, 86, now living with a niece 2 hours away, having lost the home she had raised 4 children and buried a husband in. He went to her himself. He drove out and knocked on the niece's door, and he sat in a kitchen that was not hers and drank coffee that was not hers, the way his father had sat in her kitchen every Christmas for 30 years, and he told her that her building was hers again. If she wanted it rebuilt at a rent, she could pay for the rest of her life. And Miss Ada Price, who had not been able to place the tall man at the door, at first suddenly saw his father in his face, and she put down her cup and she said, "You're Nathaniel's boy. You're little Darius that used to carry the ham." And she wept, and Darius wept, and she came home. She lived 4 more years in the building Nathaniel King built at the rent. Nathaniel King would have charged because Nathaniel King's son took back what was stolen and gave it to the person it belonged to. That, and not the boardroom, is the moment Darius considers the real end of the story. The boardroom was where he chose not to become a thief. Miss Ada's kitchen was where he became finally his father's son. The money on that screen, all of it, the house on the water and the cars and the boat and the offshore accounts, was clawed back and channeled into that restitution so that the fruits of a 12-year theft became in the end the funding of its own reversal. And Grant and Sloane Merrick. They kept enough to live on, as Darius had said, a modest life in a modest place. their names permanently attached to the public record of what they had done. Their stolen reputation gone, their empire dissolved. Grant never really recovered, not because of the lost money, but because of the lost story. He had built his whole sense of himself on being the smartest man in every room, the one who saw the angles others missed. And to have that man exposed publicly and permanently as a thief who was ultimately outplayed by the son of his victim was a wound to his vanity that no modest life could soothe. Ha grew bitter and small, and Darius, when he thought about it at all, felt something almost like pity. Like the pity you feel for a man who had everything and understood none of it. Sloane was different. About a year into the unwinding, when the worst of it was done, Darius received a letter from her handwritten, and he almost didn't open it, and then he did. It was short. It did not ask for anything. It said that she had spent the year since the boardroom sleeping, actually sleeping for the first time in 12 years, and that she understood now that the thing that had been keeping her awake was not fear of getting caught, but the weight of an unconfessed truth, and that Darius, by exposing it, had lifted a weight she had not been strong enough to lift herself. "You could have destroyed us," she wrote, "and no one would have blamed you, least of all me. You chose to make us give it back instead. I have thought a great deal about why, and I think it is because your father raised a better man than my husband and I ever were, and I think that is the real reason you won and always would have. Thank you for taking back what we stole. Thank you, more than I can say, for not taking our lives in exchange, because you would have been within your rights. And I would not have been strong enough to survive it, and I have a daughter, and she deserves a mother who is trying to be better more than she deserves to be punished for her parents. I'm trying to be better. It is the only restitution I have left to make. I wanted you to know that it landed." Darius kept the letter. He never wrote back, but he kept it next to the only photograph he had of his father sitting in Miss Ada Price's kitchen, because the two of them together, the confession and the ham, were the whole meaning of the thing he had done. It was not the annihilation that the man at the foot of the hospital bed had promised. It was something Darius came to believe was better and harder and more like his father. It was justice without cruelty, restitution without becoming the thief, a reckoning that returned everything to the wronged and yet refused to manufacture new wreckage for the sake of the wound. Some people, when they heard the story, said Darius should have destroyed them. Darius understood why people said it. He had wanted to in that boardroom with everything in him. But he had learned the thing his father knew, which is that the desire to destroy the people who hurt you is the last gift they give you. The seed of themselves they plant in you as they go, and that the only way to truly beat them is to refuse to let it grow. He went to his father's grave when it was all finished. He told him it was done. And he told him the truth, which was that he had not in the end done exactly what his father asked with his dying breath, and that he hoped his father, the real one, the living one, the one who had built a kingdom for people the world threw away, would understand why. "You told me to take everything from them," Darius said to the stone, "and I took everything they took, and I gave it back to the people they took it from, and I left them their lives. Because you didn't raise me to be them, Pop. You raised me to be you, and a king gives homes back. He doesn't take them, even from thieves. That's the whole thing you taught me, and I almost forgot it in a boardroom. And then I remembered right at the end because you were in the room with me. You always were. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Somebody someday is going to hand you the knife. It might take 12 years the way it took Darius 12 years, but if you live long enough and work hard enough, the day tends to come when you finally hold power over the people who once held power over you, when the ones who hurt you are cornered at the end of your table, and everything they have is traceable, and everything they did is provable, and you could with a word take everything from them. And in that moment, you will discover what you actually are, because the desire will be overwhelming, and it will feel exactly like justice, and it will be in a sense deserved. And the hardest, rarest, most powerful thing a human being can do is what Darius King did with his hand halfway to the order to take back what was stolen, to make the wronged whole, to let the truth be known, and then to stop, to refuse the extra cruelty, to decline the invitation to become the thing you spent your life fighting. Because the people who wrong us are always in the end trying to make us into copies of themselves, and the only final defeat you can hand them is to remain all the way through someone they could never understand. Take back everything they took, give it to the people it belongs to, and keep your own soul. Because that's the one thing they were really after, and it's the one thing you never have to let them have. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. Because someone out there tonight is holding a wound that's telling them to destroy, and they need to hear that you can have your justice and your soul at the same time, that those were never a trade. Leave a comment and tell me, if you were Darius in that boardroom with the knife in your hand, would you have put it down? I read every single one and they stay with me. Until the next story, remember this and hold it close. Take back what was taken, return it to the people it belongs to, and then stop. Not one cruelty more, because the very last thing the people who hurt you are trying to steal is the person you were raised to be, and that is the one thing you never ever have to hand them.